The first time Ethan realized he wasn't alone in his house, it wasn't because he saw anything. He felt it. A strange shift in the air, a presence that didn't belong, the eerie certainty that eyes were on him when he turned his back. He dismissed it at first. Maybe he was just tired. Work had been hell, and he hadn't slept properly in days. But then little things started going missing. Food. At first, it was small. An apple he swore he left on the counter. A protein bar he thought. He'd eaten but wasn't sure. Then it escalated. A full plate of leftovers vanished overnight. A carton of milk he'd barely touched was suddenly empty. He checked the fridge at night, noting what was there, only to wake up and find things rearranged, stolen. The lock-on. His door was fine. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. And then, one night, he heard it. A soft, nearly imperceptible rustling. The sound of a cabinet opening. A breath, sharp, startled, like someone had been caught doing something they shouldn't. Ethan moved quickly, flipping the kitchen light on, his pulse spiking as he turned. And there she was. Thin. Too thin. Not human. She froze, mid-movement. A piece of bread clutched in her delicate clawed fingers. She was crouched on his counter, her large luminous eyes reflecting the light, pupils narrowing like a predator's caught in the act. Her skin was smooth, an eerie shade between violet and pale blue, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her hair was long, tangled, almost shimmering in the artificial glow, cascading over her bare shoulders. She was wearing his hoodie, one he'd thought he lost months ago, hanging loose over her frame, barely covering the slim curve of her thighs. Ethan's breath hitched. She shouldn't be here, but she was. And she was watching him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled tight, one wrong move away from snapping. He should have been scared. He should have yelled, reached for something, anything to defend himself. But all he could think about was how fragile she looked, how hollow her cheeks were, how her fingers trembled around the stolen bread. "You're starving," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted to the exit, muscles tensing like she was ready to bolt. But something in his tone must have reached her, because instead of running, she hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came out, and that's when Ethan saw them. Her teeth. Not fully fangs, but sharper than a human's. A glimpse of something both dangerous and delicate, like a wild animal caught between fear and instinct. Slowly, carefully, Ethan raised. His hands, non-threatening open palms. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he murmured, taking a cautious step forward. She flinched, pressing herself tighter against the wall like a cornered animal. He stopped immediately. Her throat worked, swallowing down something that wasn't there. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Not afraid." Ethan let out a breathless chuckle, more out of shock than amusement. "I think I should be," he admitted. Her gaze flickered over him, studying, assessing. Then, with painstaking slowness, she lowered the bread to her lap, fingers twitching over the fabric of his hoodie. Her hoodie now, apparently. She shifted, and the movement was mesmerizing, the way the oversized sleeves slid down her arms, revealing just a glimpse of the strange, intricate patterns along her skin. Not tattoos, something deeper, woven into her biology. Ethan forced himself to look away, focus on her face instead of the way the dim kitchen light cast shadows over her collarbones, highlighting the two prominent lines of her ribs beneath the fabric. "How long have you been here?" he asked. Silence. Then softly, "Long time." Something cold settled in Ethan's stomach. He glanced at the fridge, the missing food, the quiet disturbances in his home that he'd dismissed as exhaustion. Months. She had been here for months. "You live here?" His voice came out more stunned than accusatory. A flicker of something crossed her face. Guilt. Defiance. Hunger. Then she nodded. Just once. Ethan exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. There were so many things wrong with this situation that he didn't even know where to start. An alien girl had been squatting in his home, living under his roof, wearing his clothes, eating his food, breathing the same air as him for months, and he hadn't noticed. That should have terrified him. But all he could think about was the way she was looking at him now, expecting something, a punishment, a rejection, a dismissal. Instead, Ethan turned, opened the fridge, and pulled out the last slice of pizza he'd been saving. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward her. Her fingers twitched. Her eyes darted between the food and his face, searching, cautious. "You're giving this to me?" He shrugged. "You already ate everything else. Might as well share." Her lips parted slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. Instead of taking the food immediately, she watched him with that same predatory intensity, something shifting in the air between them. Ethan felt it in his bones, a slow, creeping awareness, a new kind of tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way her gaze lingered on his throat, his hands, his mouth. She reached for the pizza and bit into it. Not carefully, not cautiously, desperately. Ethan barely had time to react before she moaned, a soft guttural sound that sent a sharp, involuntary jolt down his spine. He shouldn't have found that sound attractive. He shouldn't have been watching the way her throat worked, the way her lips parted, the way she devoured the food like it was the only thing keeping her alive. But he did. And when her gaze flicked, up to meet his, slow and deliberate, something shifted between them. "You taste different," she murmured, voice almost teasing but layered with something else. Ethan blinked. "What?" She licked her lips, tilting her head. "Your food. It tastes different." A pause, then softer. "You taste different." His stomach clenched. That wasn't an accident. That was an invitation. And for the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't just sheltering something dangerous. He was desired by it. And she had no intention of hiding that anymore. Of all the things Ethan had expected from tonight, standing in his own kitchen while a starving alien girl, one who had been secretly living in his house for months, licked her lips and all but devoured him with her eyes, was not one of them. His pulse hammered against his ribs, too fast, too loud, like his body was catching up to the sheer impossibility of the moment. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker, the way she watched him, the way her tongue darted out to catch the last remnants of sauce from her fingertips. Too deliberate, too knowing, sent a fresh wave of something sharp and electric through him. She was playing with him. That realization should have come with some kind of alarm, a warning bell in his brain telling him that this was dangerous, that he should be careful. But instead, it just made his skin prickle with heat. He knew that look. He had seen it before, but never from something not human. Never from something that shouldn't have wanted him the way she clearly did. His grip on the counter tightened. He should be asking questions. He should be figuring out what the hell was going on, why she was here, what she wanted from him beyond just food. But instead, all he could do was hold her gaze as she took another slow, measured bite of the pizza, her delicate fingers curling around the crust, her throat moving as she swallowed. She knew exactly what she was doing, and God help him. So did he. "You've been in my house this whole time," Ethan finally said, his voice lower than he intended, rougher. She nodded once, still chewing, still watching him, eyes flickering, over his face, down to his chest, then back up again, like she was committing every inch of him to memory, like she was measuring him. It should have unnerved him. It should have. It didn't. How? He asked, though he wasn't sure if he meant. How had she gotten in? Or how had she stayed hidden for this long? Or how the hell did she manage to make eating look so sinful? She swallowed, licked the corner of her lips again, then answered. "You didn't notice." A simple statement. Matter of fact. Not an Accusation, not a defense. Just the truth. Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. Jesus, he muttered. That's insane. I live here. I would have. Would you? The interruption was so soft, so certain that it made him stop. She tilted her head, her long, silvery hair slipping over her shoulder, the strands catching the dim kitchen light in a way that made them look almost iridescent. You are alone, she murmured, voice smooth, almost hypnotic. You work late. You come home tired. You do not check your shadows. Ethan's jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong. He hadn't noticed because he hadn't been looking. He'd gone through his routine on autopilot, never once questioning the subtle shifts in his home, never once considering that something, or someone, was moving in the spaces he ignored. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. She watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. Then, as if sensing his unease, she shifted on the counter, tucking one leg up beneath her. The oversized hoodie she had claimed slipped off one bare shoulder, exposing more of the strange, intricate patterns along her skin. Swirling, delicate ridges that looked almost bioluminescent up close. They pulsed faintly, a soft glow beneath, her skin fading in and out like breathing. Ethan's throat went dry. What are you? She hesitated, her fingers flexing against her thigh. Then, slowly, she reached up, fingertips grazing the exposed side of her neck, tracing the glowing lines as if trying to decipher herself. Lost, she said, voice barely above a whisper. Something about the way she said it, the way her gaze flickered to the side like she was suddenly somewhere else, made Ethan's chest tighten. It wasn't just hunger that had brought her here. It was something deeper, something broken. His grip on the counter eased slightly. He exhaled through his nose, grounding himself. Okay, one thing at a time. You don't have anywhere else to go, he guessed. She looked back at him then, those eerie, luminous eyes meeting his, unblinking, searching. I have here, she murmured. The way she said it, so simple, so absolute, sent a sharp, unexpected heat through him. He clenched his jaw, pushing past it. Focus. So what happens now? Ethan asked, keeping his voice steady. You've been sneaking around, eating my food, wearing my clothes. His eyes flicked involuntarily to the way his hoodie barely hung onto her frame. Too loose, too short, too distracting. What do you want from me? For the first time, she smiled. It was slow, deliberate, a careful unfurling of lips that revealed just the hint of sharp teeth, something both teasing and predatory. And when she spoke, her voice was different this time, softer, huskier, carrying something dangerous beneath the surface. I want, she murmured, to stay. Ethan's pulse slammed against his ribs. She slid forward, just slightly, shifting, her weight on the counter, her knees parting the smallest fraction as she tilted her head, like she was testing something, waiting for his reaction. I have been here for months, she continued, her voice smooth as silk. I have learned your scent, your sounds, your habits. Her lips parted just slightly, a slow inhale, like she was drinking him in. I know you. Ethan's fingers curled against the countertop. Fuck, his brain was screaming at him to regain control of this situation, to pull back, to breathe, but his body was betraying him. His skin felt too hot, his nerves thrumming with something primal. She was so alien, so unlike anything he had ever seen. Yet here she was, moving closer, invading his space like she had every right to be there. And the worst part, she did. Because she had already been living in his home, slipping through the cracks in his life, existing in the spaces he had overlooked. This wasn't new to her. It was new to him. He should stop this. He should tell her no. Instead, he swallowed hard and asked, "And what do I get out of this?" She laughed. A low, velvety sound that sent another sharp jolt straight through his core. Then, without breaking eye contact, she slid off the counter. The movement was fluid, too graceful, her bare feet making no sound as they touched the cool tile. She stood close, too close, tilting her head up slightly to meet his gaze. The difference in height didn't seem to bother her. If anything, she used it to her advantage, tipping her chin, letting her strange, otherworldly features catch the dim light. "What do you want?" she whispered. The words were a challenge, an invitation. Ethan exhaled sharply, his restraint fraying at the edges. What did he want? To understand her? Yes. To know why she was really here? Absolutely. But also, God help him, to see just how far she was willing to take this game. And judging by the way she was looking at him, he had a feeling she already knew the answer. Ethan was dangerously aware of how close she was. The space between them was nothing now, a breath, a decision, a single misstep away from something neither of them could take back. She stood there, looking up at him with those glowing, inhuman eyes, her expression unreadable yet completely deliberate, as if she already knew what would happen next. His muscles tensed, instinct screaming at him to do something, pull away, push forward, reclaim control of the situation before she did. But she was too still, too patient, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for him to figure out what she already seemed to understand. "What do I want?" he echoed, his voice lower than before, rougher, weighted by something heavier than just words. She nodded, slow and expectant, her glowing markings pulsing faintly in the dim kitchen light, a rhythm almost synchronized with the pounding of his pulse. Ethan's jaw tightened. His mind was racing, flipping through every possible answer, every logical way to handle this, every reason why he shouldn't let her pull him deeper into whatever this was. But none of them mattered, because the real answer, the one that burned at the back of his throat, had already made itself known. He wanted to know why she had chosen him, why his house, why his space, why him, and, more than anything else, he wanted to know just how far she was willing to go. He let the silence stretch between them, watching for a flicker of hesitation, a tell, anything that might reveal if she was bluffing. But she didn't flinch. She didn't waver. She just waited. She knew he was going to break first, and damn her, she was right. Ethan shifted forward, just slightly, just enough to test the space between them. The reaction was immediate. Her pupils dilated, her breath caught, her lips parted ever so slightly. It was subtle, but real. She wasn't just playing. She wasn't unaffected. Ethan's stomach tightened, heat coiling low as the realization sent a sharp jolt of something dangerous through him. His voice was quiet when he spoke again, deliberate. "You've been watching me all this time." She nodded once, barely a movement. "You know how I live, what I do." He exhaled sharply, searching her expression for any hint of deception. "What else do you know?" Her lips curled, not quite a smile, but close, dangerously close. "Enough," she murmured. Ethan's fingers curled at his sides. "Enough for what?" Her head tilted again, slow, calculating, her gaze drifting, not just over his face this time, but lower, tracking the tension in his shoulders, the way his chest rose and fell with each measured breath. "Enough," she repeated, softer this time. "To know you have been just as alone as I have." The words hit somewhere deep, deeper than he wanted to admit. He shouldn't react to them. He shouldn't let her get under his skin. But she already had, because she was right again. Ethan had stopped noticing things, not just the little details in his home, not just the strange shifts in his routine, but himself. He had stopped paying attention to his own loneliness, to the slow decay of connection, to the way his world had shrunk down to work, eat, sleep, repeat. And she had been there, living in the spaces he had abandoned, taking up the emptiness he had ignored. She had noticed him in ways no one else had. The weight of it settled between them, thick and unspoken, thrumming like an invisible tether neither of them had acknowledged until now. His throat worked around a response, but before he could find the words, she shifted. Closer again. Too close. Her fingers ghosting along the hem of his hoodie. The one she had stolen. The one that still smelled like him. The fabric bunched slightly between her fingers, her nails pressing in just enough to send a shiver up his spine. "I came here for warmth," she murmured. "For safety." A pause, her glowing eyes flickering up to meet his. "I stayed for you." Ethan's pulse slammed against his ribs. His breath left him in a slow, measured exhale, but it did nothing to steady the heat rolling through his veins. There was no mistaking what she meant. She had been waiting for this. For him. For the moment. When the tension between them finally snapped. And God help him, he could feel the last fraying threads of his restraint pulling tighter and tighter. His voice was strained when he finally spoke. "You've been living in my house, eating my food, wearing my clothes, and now you think you can just decide this is where you belong." Her fingers curled tighter in the fabric. Yes. One word. Absolute. Ethan's breath stilled. His pulse pounded. The air between them felt charged, dangerous, like a live wire sparking just beneath the surface of something neither of them could control anymore. His mind was screaming at him to be careful, to think, to stop. But then she moved, slow, deliberate, measured. She pressed closer, her bare skin barely brushing against his, her breath warm against his collarbone. His muscles went rigid, every nerve in his body going tight as a wire. "Let me stay," she whispered. "Let me be yours." Ethan's restraint snapped. His hand shot up before he could stop himself, fingers wrapping around her wrist, halting her movement, not pushing her away, not pulling her closer, just grounding himself against the sudden, overwhelming urge to give in. A shuddering breath left him. Her pulse thrummed against his fingertips. Her skin was warmer than he expected. His jaw clenched. He was on the edge. She knew it. And she was waiting. For him to decide whether to fall or to fight. Silence stretched, thick and unbearable. Then finally, he spoke. Low, warning, his grip tightening just enough for her to feel it. "You don't know what you're asking for." Her lips parted, her breath hitching, but her gaze never wavered. "I know," she murmured, and this time there was no teasing, no game, just certainty. Ethan exhaled sharply, his grip loosening just slightly, his head tilting down as if he could somehow escape the weight of her stare. He had to make a choice, because if she stayed, if he let her stay, he knew this wouldn't end where it had started. It wouldn't just be about food anymore, wouldn't just be about shelter, wouldn't just be about her survival, because she wanted more than that. And worse, so did he. Ethan's grip on her wrist didn't loosen. If anything, his fingers curled tighter, his pulse drumming against his skin, the tension thrumming like a high-voltage wire between them. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. Instead, she watched him with those unnervingly steady eyes, her breathing slow and deliberate, her bare skin radiating warmth where it brushed against him. The awareness of her was impossible to ignore. The press of her body, the faint scent of something not quite human, the subtle way her glowing markings pulsed, synchronized with a rhythm he wasn't sure belonged to him or to her. She knew exactly what she was doing. The thought sent another sharp jolt through him, coiling tight in his gut. Ethan inhaled, trying to clear his head, but the scent of her filled his lungs. Earthy, electric, something faintly sweet that didn't belong to any soap or detergent he owned. It was her, and it was driving him insane. She was waiting for him to speak, for him to move, for him to decide, and damn it, she wasn't playing fair. "You don't get to just walk into my life and decide you belong here," he ground out, his voice lower than before, rougher, edged with something dangerously close to want. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, considering. Then, slowly, Her free hand lifted, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in something far more dangerous. Her fingers barely ghosted, against the edge of his jaw, tracing a path up to his cheek, as if she were testing the shape of him, memorizing him. Ethan stiffened. His grip tightened on her wrist, a silent warning. But she didn't stop. She dragged the tip of her clawed fingers lower, following the sharp line of his jaw, down to the curve of his throat, stopping just before she reached the pounding pulse. At his neck, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're the one holding on to me." Ethan's entire body went rigid. She was right. His breath left him in a slow, measured exhale, but it did nothing to steady the raw tension stretching between them. He knew he should let go, put distance between them, reclaim some kind of control over this situation. But he didn't. He didn't move, didn't push her away, didn't do a damn thing except let the unbearable weight of her words settle over him like a noose, tightening inch by inch. She noticed. Of course she did. Her lips parted, slightly, the faintest trace of something like amusement flickering in her expression. But it wasn't mocking, it was expectant, as if she had already seen the ending of this story, and she was simply waiting for him to catch up. Ethan exhaled sharply, his grip on her wrist loosening just enough to allow movement, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, just slightly, just enough for her breath to warm the side of his neck, for the faintest brush of her lips to skim the skin there. A test, a challenge, a dare. Ethan's jaw clenched. His entire body was locked tight, every muscle coiled with restraint. She was pushing him to the edge, deliberately, waiting for him to either fall or fight. And the worst part, he didn't know which he wanted more. His voice was strained when he finally spoke. "You're playing a dangerous game." She didn't pull away, didn't falter, didn't so much as blink. "Then play with me." Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. Shit. That shouldn't have made his pulse stutter. But it did, because she didn't say it like a joke. She didn't say it like a tease. She said it like a promise. Like she had already decided he was going to lose. And maybe, he already had. The silence stretched between them. Thick, electric, the air too hot, too close, too much. Ethan's thoughts were a tangled mess, every rational instinct screaming at him to put an end to this before it spiraled any further out of control. Before he spiraled. But then, she shifted again. Barely an inch, just enough for her chest to brush against his, for her fingers to trail. Lower, pressing lightly against the pulse at his throat. She felt it, the way his heartbeat jumped. She knew. Ethan's breath hitched, but before he could react, before he could think, she suddenly, finally, pulled back. Not far, not nearly far enough. Just enough to look him in the eyes, her expression unreadable, her lips parting just enough to ruin him completely. "You can tell me to leave," she murmured. "Right now. Tell me you don't want this, and I'll go." Ethan's pulse pounded. His breath came shallow. He should say it. It would be so damn easy to say it. Tell her to leave. End this. Put space between them before it was too late. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because she wasn't lying. She would leave. She would vanish back into the shadows, back into whatever life she had lived before this. And she wouldn't come back. And, for reasons he didn't want to examine too closely, that thought hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers curled. He should say it, should send her away, should end this. But instead, he did nothing, and the moment stretched, and stretched, until finally, she smiled, slow, knowing, triumphant, because she had her answer, and she had won. Ethan's grip twitched, but he still didn't let go. His fingers flexed against her wrist, as if testing something, testing her, testing himself, testing the threshold between logic and the undeniable pull dragging him deeper into whatever this was. She felt it, the hesitation, the war in his body, the silent argument raging behind his eyes. She had seen this before. She had caused this before, but never with him, and that made all the difference. Her gaze never wavered, not when his chest rose sharply with an unsteady breath, not when his fingers tightened again, betraying the sheer force of his restraint, not even when she felt the heat radiating off him, achingly close, so much that she could almost taste the electricity in the air between them. She was pushing him, but not recklessly. No, she was careful, deliberate, like a predator cornering its prey, not to devour, not yet, but to see if it would bite back. Because if he did, if he snapped, if he gave in, she already knew she would let him consume her whole. She wanted him to. The thought alone sent a ripple of something hot and liquid pooling deep in her core. Her breath stilled, barely contained, her body so attuned to his that she could almost feel the moment his resolve started to crack. A shudder ran through Ethan's frame, so subtle it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't already drowning in him. But she was. She was drowning, and she wanted to take him under with her. The sharp edge of his jaw tensed, his gaze darkened, dragging over her features like a slow, methodical assessment, lingering on the curve of her lips, the subtle rise and fall of her breath, the faint glow of her markings pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat he refused to acknowledge. She saw it all, felt it all, and she knew that if she so much as shifted, if she leaned in just a fraction more, if she breathed wrong, he would break. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke. "You're afraid." Ethan froze. His grip on her wrist didn't falter, but something else did. Something in his eyes, a flicker, a hesitation, a confirmation. She could have been cruel about it, could have dragged the moment out, traced the tension with her fingers, twisted it into something sharp and unbearable, but she didn't. Instead, she softened. Just slightly. Just enough. Not of me. His breath left him in a sharp, harsh exhale. He still didn't speak, didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. Because she was right. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what she was making him want. And fuck, the realization sent something, dark and heated, curling in the pit of her stomach. Because now, she knew. She had him, and he knew it too. A slow, deliberate smile curled at the edges of her lips. Not mocking, not triumphant, just knowing. Ethan's jaw tightened. He was still fighting it, fighting her, fighting himself, and losing. The moment stretched, unbearably long, thick with the kind of heat that settled in the bones and refused to let go. And then, he let go. Not of her, not of the tension, but of the last thread of denial. It was subtle at first, the way his grip shifted, not to push her away, but to pull her closer. The way his breath hitched when she didn't resist. The way his free hand twitched at his side, as if he was barely stopping himself from reaching for more. And then finally, the way his head tilted, just barely, just enough for his breath to ghost over her cheek, for his lips to part in something achingly close to surrender. She felt everything. The heat of him, the unbearable tension strung tight between them, the way his pulse pounded beneath his skin, so in sync with hers that she swore the universe itself had paused just to witness this moment. It would be so easy to close the distance, to press her lips to his, to watch him unravel, and for a breath she thought he might do it first. But then, he pulled back, just enough to infuriate her. His eyes burned into hers, dark and unreadable, but his smirk, that damn smirk. She inhaled sharply, frustration bubbling up in her chest, a mix of challenge and something far more dangerous. He was playing with fire, but so was she. And this wasn't over, not even close. Ethan's smirk lingered, a deliberate weapon meant to throw her off balance. A slow, knowing expression, infuriatingly confident, as if he had just gained the upper hand. as if pulling back first gave him control over something that had already ensnared him completely, but she saw through it, felt through it. That wasn't victory in his gaze. It was self-preservation. It was the look of a man who had just barely stopped himself from plunging headfirst into something he couldn't undo, and it thrilled her. The realization was sharp, electric, a deep pulse of satisfaction curling through her veins. He thought he was playing it safe, thought he was pulling away, when in reality, he had just thrown himself deeper into her grasp. Because now she knew that no matter how much he resisted, he wanted her, desperately, enough to fight it with, everything he had, enough that he couldn't look away even as he retreated, enough that his fingers twitched with the phantom memory of her skin beneath them, a reflex so unguarded, so telling, that she nearly laughed. Instead, she leaned in. Not much. Not enough to break him. Yet, just enough for the warmth of her breath to ghost against his skin. Just enough for the space between them to feel excruciatingly thin, stretched like a thread ready to snap at the slightest push. She didn't touch him. She didn't have to, because his body reacted anyway. She saw it in the slow, deliberate swallow of his throat, the tightening of his jaw, the way his pupils dilated in the dim light. She saw it in the way his breathing faltered, a single misstep in the careful rhythm he was trying so hard to maintain. And oh, how she reveled in it. A slow, simmering heat built in her core, dark and unrelenting, fueled by the fact that despite everything, despite his walls, despite his resistance, despite the clear battle raging in his mind, she was winning, and she wasn't about to let him forget it. "Tell me," she murmured, her voice a quiet provocation, smooth as silk, edged with something dangerous. "What are you so afraid of?" A flicker of something crossed his expression, brief, but enough for her to catch it, to see the split-second betrayal of his control before he masked it behind a scoff. But she caught everything, even the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides, as if physically restraining himself from grabbing her instead. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse, rough, but still laced with that maddening cockiness, the kind that was crumbling at the edges, desperate to hold itself together. "I think you already know the answer." She did. But she wanted to hear him say it. She wanted to drag it out of him, piece by piece, until he had nothing left to hide behind. Her lips curled, slow and deliberate. A quiet challenge. "Do I?" His gaze darkened, something dangerous flickering beneath the surface, and then he moved, not away, not this time, towards her. It wasn't much, just a subtle shift, the kind that wouldn't have meant anything in a different situation. But here, now, it was everything, because it was the first time he closed the distance, the first time he gave in even just a little, the first time he broke, and she felt all of it, the unsteady rise of his breath, the quiet tension locking his muscles, his body caught between restraint and reluctant surrender, the way his fingers twitched as if fighting the instinct to grab, to pull, to claim. She watched it all unfold, and then, slowly, painfully slowly, she tilted her head, just enough for her lips to brush the air right beside his ear. Not touching, but close enough that he felt it. Close enough that his breath hitched. Close enough that she could hear his heartbeat. Wild, frantic, betraying everything. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle, thick and unbearable before she finally spoke. A whisper, a promise. "You're still holding back." And that was what finally shattered him. Because before she could pull away, before she could take another breath, he moved, faster than she expected, faster than she could stop. But she didn't want to stop, because he grabbed her, not roughly, not violently, but with the kind of desperation that sent heat flooding through her veins, a wildfire of tension and unspoken hunger crashing all at once. Because he caved, because he lost, because in the span of a single breath he had given in completely, and she wasn't about to let him take it back. Ethan's grip on her tightened, not painfully, but with an intensity that sent a sharp thrill racing through her. His fingers curled around her wrist, his touch burning, as if torn between pulling her closer and shoving her away, but he did neither. Instead, he just held her there, his breathing heavy, his body stiff with restraint, the air between them thick enough to drown in. Her pulse hammered, not from fear, from something far more dangerous. He was so close now, close enough that his body heat wrapped around her like a second skin, close enough that she could feel the unsteady rise and fall of his chest. His scent, warm, human, irresistible, coiled around her senses, sinking into her mind like a slow intoxication. And still, he hesitated. Still, he fought it. But she could feel his will crumbling. His grip on his own restraint was slipping, unraveling, thread by thread, even as he tried to hold it together. He was caught in the center of his own battle, fighting against the inevitable, against something neither of them could stop anymore. And oh, how she loved watching him lose. She exhaled, soft and deliberate, her lips just shy of brushing his jaw. It wasn't an accident. Nothing about this moment was accidental. She knew exactly what she was doing, exactly how much it was wrecking him. And she knew, without a doubt, that he wouldn't stop her. Not this time. Not anymore. His fingers flexed around her wrist, his body tensing like a coiled spring, as if gathering the last shreds of his resolve. But it was useless. His self-control was a castle built on sinking sand, crumbling beneath the weight of something far more primal, far more undeniable. He knew it, and so did she. "I should stop this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice was rough, unsteady, dangerously close to breaking. She smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. "But you won't." A quiet inhale, a sharp exhale. Then, his grip snapped. One moment, he was holding her at arm's length. The next, he yanked her forward, their bodies colliding with a force that sent a shockwave through her. A gasp caught in her throat, but before she could make a sound, his other hand came up, fingers threading into her hair, holding her there, his forehead pressed to hers. Not a kiss. Not yet. But everything in his body screamed that he was on the edge. That one more push, one more breath, one more whisper would ruin him completely. His breathing was ragged now, his grip just shy of bruising, every muscle in his body drawn tight with tension. His control hung by a thread, and he knew, they both knew, that it was only a matter of time before it snapped altogether. She could feel it, feel the heat of his breath against her lips, feel the raw, aching hunger in the way he held her, as if letting go would be more painful than giving in. And she wanted him to give in, wanted it with a hunger that was no longer just hers. It was theirs now, tangled between them, growing, consuming, threatening to burn everything else to ash. His fingers tightened in her hair. A quiet growl vibrated in his throat, low and unsteady, as if he hated himself for how much he wanted this. And then, finally, he caved. His lips brushed hers, a fleeting touch, a hesitation still clinging to the edges of it, a final fragile moment of restraint before he shattered completely. And then he kissed her, hard, desperate, like a man who had been starving for far too long. She didn't fight it, didn't resist. Instead, she matched him, meeting him with the same intensity, the same reckless hunger, the same overwhelming need that had been building between them from the moment she set foot in his home. Because this wasn't just desire anymore. This was something deeper. Something dangerous. Something they could never take back, and neither of them cared. Ethan had lost control. He knew it the moment his lips crashed against hers, the moment the sharp inhale between them vanished into heat and pressure, and something that felt like hunger but went deeper, more primal, more dangerous, more inescapable. Her taste hit him like a slow-moving drug, something that didn't just flood his senses, but overwhelmed them, rewrote them, turned his every rational thought into a distant memory. He shouldn't be doing this. He knew that. But that part of him, the logical, cautious part, was already dissolving, buried beneath the sheer need that had taken its place. And God, the way she responded. She didn't hesitate, didn't pull away, didn't give him even a second to reconsider. She met him with the same intensity, the same urgency, as if she had been waiting, just as he had, for this exact moment to finally consume them whole. Her fingers tangled in two, his hair, sharp claws grazing against his scalp, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind him. She was not human, not fragile, not something to be handled delicately. She could handle him. She wanted him like this. Raw, unfiltered, on the edge of breaking. He groaned against her mouth, a sound he barely recognized as his own, his hands moving before he could stop them. One still tangled in her hair, holding her there, keeping her exactly where he needed her. The other slid down, trailing along the line of her waist, feeling the sharp curve of her hip beneath the too loose fabric she had stolen from his closet. That thought should have slowed him down. It should have reminded him of the absurdity of this entire situation, that just hours ago she had been a starving, half-feral intruder in his kitchen, stealing his food, glaring at him with wild, untamed eyes. But instead, it only made the tension coil tighter, because she was his problem now, his responsibility, and something in him had already decided he wasn't letting her go. She bit his lip, hard, a sharp sting, followed by the quick flick of her tongue, soothing, where she had marked him. And fuck. It sent a violent shudder through him, sent his grip tightening, sent every last thread of his restraint snapping all at once. She knew what she was doing. She knew exactly how to push him over the edge. Exactly. How to make him unravel. She had been watching him, studying him, learning how to break him down piece by piece. And it was working. God help him. It was working. He slammed her back against the counter, the sharp edge biting into the backs of her thighs, but she didn't care. If anything, it made her grin, made her eyes glint with something dangerously close to satisfaction. She liked this. Liked him like this. That realization sent something dark curling through his chest. Something that felt like possession. Like something far more dangerous than attraction. His fingers tightened in her hair, tugging her head back, forcing her throat to bare itself to him. She gasped, sharp and unsteady, but she didn't fight it. Didn't try to pull away. She let him take control, let him lean in, let him hover just above the delicate curve of her pulse, his breath hot against her skin. He could feel it, the rapid, unsteady flutter beneath his lips, the proof that she wasn't unaffected either, that she wanted this just as much as he did, maybe even more. But that realization didn't make him relax. It made him tense, because the way she was looking at him now, with her chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow breaths, with her lips parted and kiss swollen, with her golden eyes glowing too bright in the dim light of the kitchen, it wasn't just desire. It was need. Deep, instinctual, consuming. And it was only then, with her back pressed against his counter and her hands fisted in his shirt, that he remembered what she had told him. I need you. At the time, he had assumed she had meant food, shelter, survival, but now, he wasn't so sure. Because there was something else in the way she touched him, in the way she clung to him, in the way her breath hitched every time he moved. Something deeper, more desperate. Something that went far beyond mere hunger. His jaw clenched. He forced himself to pull back, just enough to meet her gaze, to search it, to see if he was right. And what he found there, it made his stomach drop. Because this wasn't just attraction. This wasn't just tension, wasn't just instincts or proximity or the sharp edge of something neither of them knew how to handle. This was a claim. She wasn't just reacting to him. She was choosing him. And suddenly, the heat between them felt different, more dangerous, more permanent. His pulse thundered. He tried to process, tried to think, tried to remember why this was a bad idea, but she didn't give him the chance. Her hands slid lower, curling into his shirt, dragging him back to her, pressing closer. And just before their lips met again, she whispered, breathless and certain, "You don't understand, Ethan." His body locked up. Something about the way she said his name, the way it settled between them, sent a shiver down his spine. "What?" he rasped. Her fingers tightened in his shirt, and then she smiled, slow, knowing, like she was about to tell him something that would change everything. "I don't just want you." Her breath fanned across his lips. "I need you." A sharp exhale, a heartbeat of silence, and then, "I need you to give me your babies." His mind blacked out. For a full second, his brain simply refused to process what she had just said. He was still reeling from the sheer force of the moment, from the way her body pressed against his, from the way his own breath was still shaking from the last kiss. And then the words finally registered, and everything came crashing to a halt. His entire body locked up. His hands, still tangled in her hair, still gripping her waist, still holding onto her like she was the only thing keeping him upright, suddenly felt too tight, too stiff, too frozen in place. "Excuse me?" His voice was hoarse, not just from the heat, from shock, from absolute, bone-deep, what the actual fuck confusion. She just grinned, like she wasn't dropping the single most life-altering bomb he had ever heard, like she hadn't just derailed his entire brain. And then, just to make it worse, just to ruin him completely, she leaned up, pressed her lips to his ear, and whispered, low and teasing, and so certain, "Isn't that what you want too?" His soul left his body, and that's when he realized he was in so much trouble. Ethan's brain short-circuited. He wasn't sure how long he just stood there, frozen in the press of her body, his breath shallow, his grip still tangled in the wild cascade of her silver-white hair. His mind struggled to catch up, to process, to even begin forming a rational response to the bomb she had just dropped at his feet, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She needed him, not just wanted, needed. And not just in some vague romantic way. No, she wanted his children, his actual children. His pulse hammered against his ribs, his throat dry, his skin burning where she pressed against him, as if her words had ignited something that he wasn't ready to face. Because the way she said it, she wasn't joking. There wasn't a hint of teasing in her voice. No sly smile meant to throw him off balance. No playful lilt meant to make him flustered. No, she had meant it. Every word. And now, with her golden eyes locked onto his, too bright, too focused, too hungry, he could feel the weight of it settling over his skin like a slow-moving current, dragging him under before he could fight it. He forced himself to breathe, to think. "Hold on." His voice came out rougher than he expected, too unsteady, too much like he was barely holding on to reality. "Did you just say, 'I need your babies'?" She said it again, just as casually, just as certainly, like it was inevitable, like this had been decided already. Ethan felt a violent pulse of heat rip through him, followed by something equally as dangerous, the sinking, gut-wrenching realization that he wasn't as opposed to, the idea as he probably should be. His fingers twitched in her hair, his jaw clenched, his entire body felt like it was walking a tightrope between control and something far, far more reckless. He had been attracted to her from the moment he saw her. That much he couldn't deny. Even back when she had been a half-starved, feral-eyed intruder stealing from his kitchen, she had still been breathtaking. Something about her had buried itself under his skin, something raw and unexplainable. And now, with her pressed against him, heat radiating from every inch of her, looking at him like he was something she had already claimed, something inside him snapped into place. And that should have terrified him, because he knew what this was. He could feel it, the way her body gravitated toward his, the way her breath hitched whenever he touched her, the way her pupils dilated, her lips parted, her heartbeat pounded against his own. This wasn't just instinct, it was biology. It was a bond forming, one that was far more permanent than a simple infatuation, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. Are you? He exhaled sharply, trying to get his thoughts in order, trying to ignore the way his body reacted to hers. Are you saying this because of some kind of reproductive drive? Like a species thing? A pause. And then she smiled, slow, knowing, like she had been waiting for him to catch up. You feel it, don't you? She murmured. Her fingers tightened in his shirt, drawing him closer until there was barely a sliver of space between them. You can sense it, the pull, the need, the way it's getting harder to resist. Ethan swallowed hard. Because fuck. She was right. He felt it. He had been feeling it ever since she stepped into his home, ever since he caught that first breath of her scent, ever since he saw her watching him like this was always meant to happen. And now it was so much worse. The tension was suffocating. Every second felt like he was teetering on the edge of something irreversible, something neither of them would be able to take back. But he had to. He had to be the rational one. He forced himself to breathe, forced his pulse to steady, forced himself to keep his hands exactly where they were, instead of dragging her closer, like every cell in his body was screaming at him to do. This isn't... He exhaled sharply. You can't just... We barely even know each other. She tilted her head, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders, her golden eyes glinting. I know enough, he groaned, dragging a hand down his face. That's not how this works. That's how it works for me. God, she wasn't making this easy. But then again, he wasn't sure if he even wanted her to, because the way she was looking at him, now with her lips slightly parted, her breath just barely brushing his skin, her body so damn close to his. He was losing this fight, and she knew it. You're overthinking it, she murmured, her fingers drifting lower, pressing against his stomach. You're still trying to rationalize it when you already know the answer. His breath hitched. Her hands were warm, too warm. His entire body reacted before he could stop it, a sharp pulse of heat shooting through him like a warning. But he didn't move away, didn't stop her, didn't do anything he probably should have done. Instead, he let her touch him, let her drag her fingers down, slow and deliberate, her golden eyes never leaving his, watching him like she was testing him, seeing how much further she could push him before he broke. And Ethan was already so damn close. His jaw tightened, his fingers tensed in her hair. His entire body felt like it was burning from the inside out. He wasn't going to last. Not if she kept looking at him like that. Not if she kept touching him like this. Not if she kept saying things like, I can smell it, she whispered. The way your body is responding. He sucked in a sharp breath, but she only smiled, her lips brushing the shell of his ear as she continued, voice low and utterly intoxicating. You want me just as much as I want you. His grip snapped. Before he even realized what he was doing, he had her pinned against the counter again, his breath ragged, his body so tightly wound it hurt. And she only smirked, like she had won, like she had known all along that he wouldn't be able to resist. And maybe she was right. Maybe he was already too far gone. But if he was falling into this, then she wasn't going to get away with thinking she had the upper hand.